Let me concede at the outset that Jim Crow at its worst was more violent than the situation we face today. I don't want to recount all of the horrors of that bigotry and racism that occurred in that era. But I think the bottom line question, which we are addressing in this hearing, is whether there is a design or an intent in legislation that is being considered and passed in many states, including the state of Georgia, to limit or restrict the right to vote of minority populations with the intent of having influence on the outcome of the election. I think that goes without saying. Clearly, there's a difference in the witnesses who appear before the committee. But I'd like to ask Stacey Abrams, for example. The Speaker Pro Tem, Ms. Jones, said earlier that the new Georgia law made it easier to vote in the state. You've recounted a few instances, but can you think of elements in the law that was signed by Governor Kemp which do the opposite?
Well, first is this falsity that's been proposed that this is an expansion of rights. Let's be clear. In the state of Georgia, 60% of Georgians live in counties that already had, for example, 2 Saturdays of early voting. What has changed is that now additional counties will join the ranks, and that is a good thing. But at the same time that those counties will join those ranks, they have reduced mandatory dates. They have eliminated weeks of early voting during federal runoffs. And let's be very clear that federal runoffs in Georgia were predicated on a racist premise of eliminating access to the right to vote for African Americans. And they eliminate access to a mandatory weekend voting day. Another example is the falsity that this expands hours for voting. Yes, it codifies that you can vote between 9 to 5 as business hours. But for 78% of Georgians, prior to this bill, the hours for voting during early voting was 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. So this actually eliminates hours of voting and mandates only a shortened period of time. That was the misunderstanding that I think is still misunderstood by the Washington Post, because early voting hours that exceed that are now optional and not mandatory. We have 78% of Georgians who would experience longer voting hours and now will see shortened hours. In addition, there is a narrative that says that the use of a Social Security number is allowed for returning your absentee ballot if you do not have access to the ID. Well, let's be clear. You cannot apply for an absentee ballot with your Social Security number. You must have some forms of identification that are unavailable to currently 200,000 Georgians. Those are just a few of the issues. And I will certainly address the criminalization of the handing of water. We have to be clear that in the state of Georgia, 8-hour lines for communities of color has become not an unusual circumstance. Usually we've seen between 4 and 8-hour lines. People do not often come prepared to stand in line for the whole of a business day. They certainly don't often bring their food with them. And this ignores the fact that the overworked poll workers who are inside those buildings do not have the time to come out and hand out refreshments since they are busy processing so many voters who have been underserved. And so I would use those as a few examples of why this bill is deleterious in its effect and malicious in its intent.
Ms. Jones, I'd like to ask you to respond to this question. There was an allegation made by the former president of the United States relating to the voting in the state of Georgia. He went so far at one point in the recorded conversation to say that 5,000 dead people had voted. Mr. Raffensperger replied that there were only 2 that they could find, and that was 2 too many. But I would like to ask you if you would comment on the 2020 election. Do you believe there was voter fraud in Georgia, as President Trump alleged?
You know, I'm here to discuss what's in Senate Bill 202, not relitigate the 2018 election in which my former colleague Stacey Abrams never conceded, nor am I here to relitigate the 2020. What I can say is that the bill does increase accessibility. 47 counties had no 2 Saturdays of voting and will be required to now under this bill. Additionally, not one single Georgian will have reduced hours of voting and early voting because it allows up to 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. But what it does do is mandate from 9 in the morning to 5 p.m. And we had 134 counties with less or fewer voting hours for early voting.
Ms.
The
Jones,
bill absolutely does increase the amount.
if I could follow through on that, the reason for my question is this. I'm trying to understand the logic behind new voting laws, which would give less time to request absentee ballots, strict new ID requirements for absentee ballots, illegal for election officials to mail out absentee ballot applications and the like. In light of the 2020 election, I believe Mr. Raffensperger spoke the truth, and there certainly was no evidence to suggest otherwise when he suggested that the election in 2020, following the old law, was absent any major voting fraud and should not be questioned in terms of results. So if the premise was 2020 was sound, why the changes that restricted certain practices that created opportunities for people to vote in Georgia?
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, for the question. Since 2003, 59 elections bills have been passed by the Georgia General Assembly, at least one each of every year. After the 2018 elections, we had an elections bill that addressed some of the concerns expressed by Democrats. In this bill, after a worldwide pandemic, record turnout, a new election system, once again, we're coming back to address concerns expressed by both Democrats and Republicans. The bill absolutely will reduce the long lines, and it will make clear that it makes clear there has to be proper notice so that voters can know if a precinct is changed. It has to require notice at the old precinct location with a 4-foot by 4-foot sign, also at the new location. There are many provisions in it, but let me just mention specifically with regard to your question about shortening absentee days to request an absentee ballot. As recommended by the Association of County Commissioners, which is a bipartisan group, and the U.S. Postal Service, our timing to request an absentee ballot allowed someone to request one the Friday before the regular election, which almost certainly meant they would have an unsuccessful vote. And so this moves it back to 10 days, which is more expansive, I will admit, 11 days than what the U.S. Postal Service recommended, which was 14 days. But it, I do believe, will result in more successful absentee ballots cast, regardless of whether one lives anywhere in the state and whether they're a Democrat or a Republican.
I'd just say in conclusion that giving Georgia voters under the new law less time to request absentee ballots and shutting down the number of drop boxes from 94 to 23 cannot make it easier to vote or create more opportunity. I think just the opposite is the case. Senator Grassley?
No, I don't know what you're talking about. Speaker Jones,